happy accidents. Let's talk about JD Vance. All right. Welcome back to Appodlachia, people. My name is Chuck Core. I'm joined, as always, from several hundreds of miles away, perhaps even thousands. I don't know. John Eisner, Big John Eisner. People are saying we got a doozy today, John.
Yeah, that's the big one.
Can
we talk real quick about the? I think first we have to say thank you, Chuck. We got to say thank you to everybody who has been with us for the last umpteen years and has listened to us complain about JD Vance, because it's so funny that I saw, and I'm not saying like we're not ahead of the game. Like, people wrote actual books. Like they're the people who should be like talked to about like anti JD Vance stuff. Like, we just talk on microphones. But I will say, like, there were like things on Twitter and stuff where it was for sure like stuff that had come from this podcast where people were like just mentioning it, and our friends were tagging us in those and being like, actually, Appodlachia said this 4 years ago on episode blah blah blah. You know what I mean? Like, people actually funny. People knew exactly like what was going on, and they knew like most of the stuff was like rhetoric that came from this show, and wanted to make sure that we got like credit for it or something.
That's so nice of them. I love that. We have great fans. We have great listeners. I got a text from a friend that said that one of her friends who listens, when she heard the news, she said, "John Dammit Vance," which that made me very proud. And for all you listening, that is his name, his full name, John Dammit. Don't let him tell you anything else. It's not James Donald.
I mean, I went to a wedding this weekend, and I had 3 or 4 people come up and say, "I don't like him either." And it was either they were talking about my buddy Brandon, who was getting married, which I was going to say that was probably low chance, or they were talking about JD Vance, because they were supporting Brandon there. So it turns out people all over are hearing this. I've had random people that have talked to me about JD Vance that I didn't even know knew my name. So yeah, it's been pretty cool. And now we want to do. We did an episode like this before. This was how long ago was that, Chuck? You went back and looked.
It was I don't remember the exact date, but I remember where we were. It was right before the pandemic started, like right before people started getting into lockdown. It was March 2020.
Okay.
So
it was before.
Yeah, it was right before I moved back to Nashville.
So it was before lockdown and stuff.
It would have been like right before. It
Wow.
was pretty close to that time, yeah.
That's crazy to think.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And look, I mean, we referred some people to that episode, but one of the reasons we want to do this, that was one of our first episodes. I haven't went back and listened to it, but I'm just going to guess it's probably not all that polished, not that great. So yeah, we definitely wanted to do a refresh here and maybe introduce some new things to it, but also just, I mean, we have a lot of new listeners from this past week, which I guess if y'all were maybe not listening to the news, good for you. JD Vance is the vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party, which is part of our nightmares, I'm sure, and most people listening.
Yeah. Before we go too far, though, I also want to plug our Patreon real quick. I'm going to do it at the top of the episode only because it's relevant. Patreon.com/Appodlachia. We were talking about an episode going back a little ways. We are about to publish on our Patreon the exclusive this week. Chuck unearthed this. I didn't even know this existed. I'm being honest. No idea.
I didn't know it existed either until I found it.
When you told me about this, I looked at my wife and said, this is either going to be great or there's a lot of there's a lot of like really bad shit on this recording. Turns out it's super fucking funny. It is the planning meeting of the Appalachian agenda, which is what we were initially called before Appodlachia.
Thank God we changed.
Thank God. And it's a very funny like 20 minutes of us trying to plan this podcast. We talk about potential sponsors. We talk about people we could have on the podcast. We talk about getting our first like 20 followers or something. It's pretty cool to like hear that.
Trying to leverage your reality TV show connections.
That was the funniest part there. Talking about people I know from reality TV and how they could like help us get like, to 100 followers. Like, and it's so funny to think back to that because, and we'll get this episode started. Sorry, I'm not trying to go too long on this, but it is, I think, very funny to talk about the history of this podcast whenever it comes to things like that, because it's so funny the amount of work that went in to those stages of getting people to like follow us and like just to even give us a chance, like to, and you hear that in our voices as we talk about, the 20 minutes of trying to play in this thing.
Yeah, you make a great point. I'm going to be putting it out, I think, it might even be out before this episode comes out, so you have to check. Yeah, you can check out patreon.com/Appodlachia. This show will always be free.
Oh, yeah.
Patreon is just a way for us to finance, the cost of the show. And so we really appreciate the people that do support us. We've had people that have been there for several years, and we love them. Yep. So we thank them. Anyway, let's get into it. So what we're trying to do here, and what we have tried to do, is remind people who JD Vance is, because there's a lot of reporting out there about like things he said on the campaign trail, like what he said post Hillbilly Elegy, his turncoat from Trump hater to Trump lover and all that stuff. There's a lot of that stuff out there, which we will touch on a little bit. But what a lot of people are not talking about, which we think is extremely important, is the basis for his fame, the basis for why he was anything today, which is his book Hillbilly Elegy. And there's so much from that book that tells you about the person that he is, and that honestly I think should be leveraged and used against him, because it is a tome of utter contempt for the people he grew up with, the people that he now represents, and the people that, quite frankly, are going to be his primary voting bloc this November. So, without further ado, why don't we get into it? Let's get into it.
Let's jump in.
So let's start out by saying JD Vance, a little background on him, just biographical. Marine Corps vet, Yale Law grad, born in Middletown, Ohio, became a venture capital guy under Peter Thiel, started a sham nonprofit called Our Ohio Renewal that was supposed to combat the opioid epidemic, but was really used to launch his campaign. We'll get into a little bit more of that later. Became a CNN contributor in 2017, ran for Senate in 2022, suckled up to the teat of Donald Trump and won, and has since become a hardliner for MAGA people, buddied up with Donald Trump Jr., and ultimately got the nod for VP. So, first, before we start about him, John, what are your initial thoughts on Trump picking Vance?
It makes no sense. I mean, I get it. Like, it makes, okay, hold on. Let me rewind. It makes perfect sense for the ego of Donald Trump, because JD Vance will never be Batman. He will always be Robin in everything he does.
Yeah, he will.
Donald Trump.
What a bitch.
Donald Trump wants to be the person who is always looked at as the superhero, and he always wants his running mate to just be a sidekick. He nailed it there, because he got one of the least impressive people in terms of self-worth, in terms, pushing himself before pushing others. Like, JD Vance is going to push Donald Trump as far as he can, because that's all he knows how to do. He doesn't know how to actually do anything else. So that made sense. What doesn't make sense is he picked somebody that does not help him in terms of actual vote getting, except for maybe in the state of Ohio. Maybe. And Ohio, in all honesty, everybody wants to say it's a swing state. It's not. To me, at least. Ohio is a Republican state that sometimes gets flipped. But it is a Republican state.
Yeah, it's a pretty safe lock this cycle. The only exception being Sherrod Brown could win the Senate race. That's a tough race, but yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, for sure. I'm with you. So my theory, I've got a couple I'm working with here. There is a theory that he could be the natural successor to the MAGA movement.
Yeah.
I think it's a weird choice for that. He doesn't bring like the type of charisma and I don't know, sociopathy. Like he's a different type of sociopath. I don't know. My thing is, this is what I think. JD Vance has been credited with understanding the Trump voter for a long time, and I don't think that's true. I don't think he understands the Trump voter. I think he understands Trump.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason why he's been able to maneuver himself to the good graces of him. He understands how he thinks. He understands what the type of people he's looking for, a performer, someone who's got a good biographical background that can kind of balance him out, I guess. But also he knew, and it was smart, to get in good graces with Don Jr., because at the end of the day, Trump does actually listen to his kids occasionally, and JD Vance and Don Jr. have been buddies for a while now. And he played it smart in the Senate campaign. He played it smart. He didn't go too full bore in sucking up to Trump like Josh Mandel did. And he got the endorsement because he knew that's what he had to do, and he changed everything about himself in order to get it. Well, not everything about himself. We know, like, there's a lot he didn't change because it was written in Hillbilly Elegy. But as far as, like, coming out full MAGA anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think
that's my theory.
I think that's a solid point. He also, I mean, let's face it. The one thing that JD Vance is good at is manipulation. Like, he's a pretty manipulative guy. But he's good at it in the sense of it doesn't come off all the time as manipulation. Like, he can do it in the background. He's like the Windows task manager. It's like always working in the background, but you only see it when you hit Clear Alt Delete. So that's like JD Vance is Anyway, he is one of those guys who will always do what's best for himself. He also knows that Don Jr. is neither smart enough nor stable enough to take the reins on the MAGA campaign, and he knows that somebody else has to, and he knows that he can be that guy, especially if he's friends with Don Jr. already, which they've established that they have a friendship now. So that's the type of stuff I think is going to be important to him, and that I think is why he is in the position that he is in. The thing that kind of surprised me is how fast this kind of came to be. But if you look at Pence and look at Vance, right? On the surface, they're supposed to be looked at as the stable guys, right? Like, they're the guys who, like, keep everything in order. You know, yeah, Trump's a little chaotic, but at least they have a stable VP. Like, that's kind of what people see, like, Pence and him as. Like, he's supposed to be the check on Trump. He's not going to be, but that's what people think. And they only have to change 2 letters on their sign. So that's a good cost saver right there.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think I agree with you. I think the last thing I would say, and this is something I heard recently that makes a lot of sense for me, and I didn't realize this. So in 2020, Trump lost support significantly in the places that mattered among white male voters.
Okay.
Which I did not realize that. And this is a report. This was put out by Trump's pollster, Tony Fabrizio. So, like, it's legit as far as, like, his campaign's concerned. So I think from a strategic standpoint, there could be an argument that J.D. Vance was tapped in order to try to shore up their support among white men. Whether or not that's a valid assumption, that remains to be seen. But he does try to embody that sort of, like, toxic trad masculinity, like you should be having more babies kind of bullshit, like Elon Musk type circle jerk shit. And I think that there is an argument to be made that could have been a strategic play. Now, was Trump thinking that? Absolutely the fuck not. But his people were probably in his ear about it.
That's a solid point. JD Vance is the type of guy who doesn't get accepted into the fraternity, so his dad buys the house so that they have to let him in. Like, buys the frat house. Like, that's the type of guy he is. Like, nobody wants him around, but he always finds a way to get in.
Which is kind of like Trump. So
no, I mean, that's exactly right. Like, it's one of those things. Like, that's just how they are.
We can get into the actual story, I suppose, or whatever you want to call it. So I think there's an important distinction, especially for those of you who either have watched the movie and haven't read the book, or maybe just skimmed the book. There's two parts of it. There's the narrative, his personal narrative story, and then there's like his whole like preachy, this is why it's a culture in crisis analysis, if you can call it that. And we're not really going to talk much about the personal narrative. Like, that's what they cover in the movie. Great, whatever. It's a compelling story. He came from kind of a shitty childhood, shitty upbringing. And that's not the issue, ultimately. That's not the issue with the book, and I think that's what a lot of people miss. We don't take issue with his life story. It's his to tell, and we can't... Everybody has the right to tell their own story, but they don't have the right to tell everybody else's stories, and they don't have a right to make broad, sweeping generalizations about a region based on their own experience, and that's what he does. This is like a pretty extreme case study in dysfunctionality with his family, too, by the way. It's very, like, fucking wild. So that's important at the outset. And I want to say, we're not going to shit on people who, like, maybe they like the book, whatever, or maybe they used to like the book. There's a lot of people that read it without a critical lens, such as myself when I first read it a long time ago, and didn't really think much of it and thought, okay, this is an interesting story. Perhaps it's a good book. The more you look at it, you have to read it, and you have to read what he's saying. And when you do, you realize just how craven and, quite honestly, how terrible this book is. This is how we're going to break it down a little bit. These are the big takeaways right here. Number one, Vance has a chip on his shoulder. He grew up in a shitty household. He felt for his whole life like, I'm not like one of these people. I'm better than them. I'm a hard worker, yada, yada, yada. I'm not one of these people. I'm going to make something of myself. He's got this chip on his shoulder, and it's obvious throughout this entire book. And this book, Hillbilly Elegy, was the first step in him exercising his grudge and resentment towards the people he grew up around. And he uses this personal experience and unsubstantiated observations to make broad, sweeping generalizations and accusations about an entire subset of a society, which is Appalachia. That is the main critique that we have about this. What this book does, though, is that it echoes the typical out-of-touch conservative touchstones of the need for religion and like cultural conservatism and masculinity and personal responsibility and like this sort of Christian nationalism, and repackages it in a clever way that masks it with personal tragedy. That is what this is. And lots of people fell for it and still do. And a couple other things I'll say about this, because then I want your take, John. The major issue with how it's just written, and this is, I think Meredith McCarroll really does a great job of explaining this, and I'm paraphrasing. He shifts from the first person singular point of view, which is using I, me, or my, or mine, to the first person plural, which is we, us, ours. He is speaking for himself, but then he transitions to speaking for all of us. And he does not speak for all of us, nor can anybody about Appalachia. And that's where we run into problems. For example, he'll say things like, we're a pessimistic bunch, us Appalachians. We pass down our isolation to our children. That was in the first 2 pages of the book. Those are the things that, like, most people, including ourselves, we took issue with. Because he starts going off on not just about his own personal experiences, but then drawing inferences about we, as in we all feel this way. And then last, and perhaps the biggest reason why this book and JD Vance himself are so damaging, is that in it he flatly rejects that a lack of economic opportunity, job insecurity, and financial instability have any role to play in the poverty, addiction, and mental health crisis in the region. He chalks it all up to, well, it's your own fault, people just aren't working hard enough, and you can overcome anything if you just pull yourself up by the bootstraps. That is incredibly damaging, because it just is such a dishonest diagnosis of the problems of the region. That is my opening statement.
Great. I mean, those are great points. This is why JD Vance having actual credentials is so dangerous.
Yeah.
He's a guy who's looked at as he's a very, very smart guy, right? Like, that's what people think. He's got a JD. He's been able to run hedge funds. He's been able to build businesses, whatever you want to say. he has real credentials. There's no denying that. So whenever he puts pen to paper, people tend to listen. It gives them the power of their listenership. That's why this book is so bad in terms of what it can do and what it has done to many parts of the region and to the people here. He puts in the book throughout it opinion stated as fact. That is a common theme for the entire book. He even goes to make up statistics, literally makes it up throughout the entire book, where he'll give percentages that sound credible, but then you go, wait a second, how the hell would he know that? Like, it's not possible. That doesn't exist. Yeah. And then you start to do research. Oh wait, it doesn't exist. He made it up. Like, it's a bunch of stuff that he made up to create overgeneralizations to make it easier to write his book. This is honestly what I think happened. He got through like 3 chapters of it and was like, shit, I can't finish this just based off me. So what am I going to do? Open it up. Then he starts trying to be this, savior or movement or martyr for the entire region when he doesn't know anything about the region. Wasn't born here. Yeah, he's got some connection that people try to debate it. Yeah, he's got connection, whatever. He's certainly not a messenger for the region, even though he wants to be. Throughout it, made it very clear that his goal was to use this narrative to push his life along, and that other people could have used that narrative to do the same thing. He often forgets that he's one of the lucky ones. Yes, he had this background of, his mom going through these issues, but he also had great grandparents. His grandfather made over $100,000 in the 80s in his job. Like, he lived a very good lifestyle for a guy who claims he grew up in a shitty environment. Did he have some stuff that went wrong? Sure, everyone does. But he's also one of the people who got lucky with circumstances, which in Appalachia is not a common theme. Most people get unlucky. Just happens. That's just the way it is. And most of the time, the unluckiness, in quotes, is usually due to some socioeconomic issue that they just cannot get themselves out of. JD Vance was not a pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It was literally his grandparents tying his boots every step of the way. That's the difference between JD Vance and most people in this region, is that we have to actually push forward to try to get out of things without the betterment of these circumstances. When JD Vance did get the betterment of the circumstances, there's no denying that JD Vance worked very hard. No denying that. You wouldn't become a vice presidential candidate if you didn't work hard. Thing is, you can work hard and still be a dickhead, and JD Vance proves that.
Yeah, 100%. One thing that I would just point out too is, like, even if he were unimpeachably, like, from the region, Appalachian through and through, he still doesn't get to speak for everyone. We don't.
We don't get to speak.
Hell no. And some people have misinterpreted what we do. This podcast is like speaking for the region. We don't. We are just one perspective. I just wanted to make that clear. But yeah, he doesn't get to speak for everybody, even if he, was unimpeachably Appalachian as fuck. And the other thing, too, one thing I wanted to mention, which I think is important, is the reason why this book became popular and took off more than it probably should is because of the context of when it came out. It was published in 2016, became popular really after the election because people were looking to try to understand why Donald Trump won, because it was flabbergasted everybody. Look, and I was surprised he won, truthfully. Now our politics is completely different from then, but people looked at it as like, oh, this is an explanation of why there's so much resentment and how these people think and blah-de-blah-de-blah. And this is a guy that's from there, but he talks like us. He has money like us. He lives in San Francisco and D.C. like us. That was like the context of how this came out and how it evolved into what it is now.
It's also one of those things, too. It reminds me of the haves and have-nots. The haves are the ones who read this and thought, finally, we know the answer. And then the have-nots are the people that were put in their place by this book. It was a way for people who thought a certain way to hide behind, it's like monsters coming to your door and you're hiding behind it, right? Until you finally figure out who the monsters really are. That's what this book was about for a lot of these people, was They wanted somebody to blame. They wanted an easy explanation, and they didn't want it to be their neighbors. Those were the three things that they wanted. What do? They find the people who don't look like them, don't act like them, don't talk like them. It had to have been them. It's the outsider's perspective.
Right. Well, and there was also people that like were staunch Hillary Clinton supporters, your classic liberal who were like, how could these hillbilly buffoons vote this way? And this gave them a permission structure and an excuse.
We had people too talking about like how, I remember in my opinion, this book kind of took off, and I mean, I might be wrong, but I saw it a lot more in like 2017, 2018 is where I started to see it the most. And you even saw people who were like, this is why certain people shouldn't get to vote. It was supposed to show, it was supposed to put our region in its place, essentially, as the uneducated, followers of Donald Trump, because that's the only people who could ever support Donald Trump are idiots, these uneducated idiots. And that was what the book was made for.
Yeah.
And it worked out perfectly for JD.
Yeah, well, first of all, like, let's not reinstitute things like a poll tax, guys. Jesus Christ. It doesn't matter how dumb you are, you get the right to vote like everybody else. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, and look, and I think like there are, just want to be clear, there are absolutely things about his story that are compelling, and if this book were just about his story, it would probably be a good book. I mean,
that's the thing.
He's a good storyteller.
Could have just told a story.
His grandma
could have just told it.
His grandma and mom seem fucking insane. His grandma sound like a real good time, but like it's just, and it's shameful that he weaponized their stories to do this. But let's get into it. So the first opening anecdote, which we're gonna go through like big parts of this. This is not the whole book. Maybe one day I'll sit down on my ass and do the whole thing. I don't know. But the opening anecdote is pretty wild, and it's one that we talked about earlier in a couple episodes ago. But it really, I think, tells a lot about who he is and how he views work and people and just things as black and white versus shades of gray. He talks about an example where he worked at a tile distribution company, like floor tiles. And he talked about, he worked there, I think, right before going to law school, and he made, I want to say it was like $12 or $15 an hour, which that was in, I think, the 80s or maybe early 90s.
Yeah.
That was a lot of money to make hourly for someone who was in college age. I don't think I made $15 an hour until law school, at least, if that. But he talks about guys that would routinely take long bathroom breaks and played hooky to, quote unquote, according to JD's words, escape hard work. And he would basically narc on them. And then he would use this. He said they would then, they would get reprimanded or fired and then claim that it was some other issue. And he uses this example as like one or two guys. And he's like, well, this is an example of a trend, a culture that increasingly encourages social decay instead of counteracting it, quote unquote. So this is where like you'll notice this theme a lot in his book, where he takes a one-off example of something he witnessed and uses it to inform his belief about an entire region and community and the aspects of culture of that region. Now, it could very well be that these people he worked with were lazy and just trying to, shoot the shit and do as little work as possible. There also could be a myriad of other reasons. We don't know. Neither did he, because he didn't bother fucking talking to these people. He just uses them, assumes the worst, and then uses it to sell books.
Good point. Solid point. I mean, that's the thing is like, did you know that 15% of the United States has IBS?
No, but God,
15%.
15%? That is a lot.
Yeah.
Irritable bowel syndrome for those of you listening at home.
It is estimated 10 to 15%. What if these guys are one of the 15%? JD wouldn't know though, because he never actually talked to him. Because he's just a narc.
Pun intended, wouldn't give a shit.
Wouldn't give a shit because they gave it all.
Yeah, well, that's a powerful metaphor that could serve multiple purposes.
That's right.
No doubt.
That's the new war motto, I guess.
For sure.
It's just the type of person, man. Like, it's another one of like, I work a certain way. Why can't you? Why do you have these excuses or this difference of opinion or difference of acting than I am.
Yeah.
You should be me. You should get in line and be more like JD. I bet he uses JD as third person.
I mean, if he could get away with it, he certainly would. He puts himself up as like the shining example of what you should be. And what's interesting is like he talks about his time in Jackson, Kentucky, because that's sort of the rub here. Is like he was born in Middletown, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cincinnati. He spent a lot of time living in Jackson, Kentucky, because I think that's where his mama and papa lived, and that's his connection to Appalachia. And you'd think that he would, I don't know, not take an absolute massive shit on the place, but he does. So he says just this about the people.
Especially when he was complaining about other people doing it.
Yeah, right. Damn, nailed it. More shit puns to come, folks. So
that's all I got.
He has so much resentment and contempt for these people, the people of Jackson, Kentucky. These are all quotes from the book. Quote, nobody's interested in holding down a job. No statistics there, don't worry, guys. He talks about walking through a broken neighborhood with his uncle. So he's talking about one time he was in Jackson. He said, quote, while passing a small two-bedroom house, I noticed a frightened set of eyes looking at me from behind the curtains of a bedroom window. My curiosity piqued. I looked closer and counted no fewer than 8 pairs of eyes. Okay, this sounds like a fucking Bugs Bunny cartoon. All looking at me from 3 windows with an unsettling combination of fear and longing. On the front porch was a thin man no older than 35, apparently the head of a household, several ferocious, malnourished, chained-up dogs protecting the furniture strewn about barren in the front yard. When I asked my uncle's son what the young father did for a living, he told me that the man had no job and was proud of it. But he added, they're mean, so we just try to avoid them. That house might be extreme, but it represents much about the lives of hill people in Jackson. So, for those of you listening at home, because that was a little bit of a long bit, he is using this one-off example of a person that he casually observed to inform about the entire population of Jackson, Kentucky. And this is coming from people who are operating on the assumption about these people. They didn't talk to them. They didn't interview them. They don't know anything about their lives except for what they just witnessed. But they can take that visual of poverty and downtroddenness and use it to describe the whole area of Jackson. And to me, I'm like, this is just disgusting. He's taking this example and using it as poverty porn.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been the term that we've used for this book, poverty porn. I think it's spot on. Quick note here, Chuck. So let's just pretend that this time period is probably in the 90s, right, for Jackson, Kentucky. Okay.
Probably, yeah.
What would you venture to guess the unemployment rate was in Jackson, Kentucky in 1991?
I have no idea. I don't even know where to guess.
6%. It was 6%. So just so everyone's aware, right now it's about 4.5%. Yeah, 4.5% for the state of Kentucky as a whole right now. It was 6% in 91 in Jackson, Kentucky.
Okay.
Right now, today in Jackson, Kentucky, it is 6%. Now,
well, how about that?
How about this, Chuck? Do you want to guess the all-time high unemployment rate of Jackson, Kentucky?
6%?
Nope.
Oh,
19%.
Damn. Jesus.
When did that happen? During the Donald Trump administration.
Oh, shit. Oh, fuck. Damn, there you go. Okay.
April of 2020 was the all-time record high of 19.7%, which just happens to be the guy that's now his running mate.
That's pretty wild. Now, I mean, there's something to be accounted for with COVID, but still, it's not it's like, okay, so 6% unemployment. That means, like all things being equal, a lot of people employed, not a lot of lazy people around there at that point. And this is just like telling of like, he pulls the stuff out of his ass because he has a platform and was given it. People believe it.
Well, and it needs to be noted too, like Jackson, Kentucky, not a huge place, right?
No.
So for instance, let's go to December of 1998, which may even be more realistic with the timeline. I don't know. 3.6% unemployment rate, 6,795 people in their workforce, 246 people unemployed.
That is not many at all.
But you're telling me that these are the laziest people you've ever met? Like, come on.
Jesus.
But this is why this book is so dangerous, is because when you start to look at actual statistics, these are the actual statistics. This is the actual breakdown of
conveniently
this area.
avoided in the book, yeah.
Right. Where you actually could see unemployment was at a significantly low rate, especially in a rural area. That's another thing to think about here, Chuck, is that this isn't the most built up place. And they still only had that low of an unemployment rate, but he wants to pretend nobody worked, no one was good at their jobs, and no one was trying to find a job. Those are the things he wants everybody to think. It's not true at all. Statistics actually show that he is way off on that, and that he's using just a few people to, cast his entire thought process on everyone else.
Absolutely. And, it's like, we're not trying to be apologists. There are things that are wrong in Jackson, I'm
1,000%.
sure of it. But we have to remember, JD Vance has been propped up as the voice of the place like this, as the person who speaks for them now. And he is going based on purely anecdotal examples that aren't even grounded in anecdotal fact at that point. These are just observations. They're not even just like one-off conversations. There was no conversation. But this is how he views this place. I want to talk a little bit more about how he views Jackson, Kentucky. He also described it as, quote, full of drug addicts, where one man can find time to make 8 children, but not time to support them. Virtuous fathers are in short supply. The people there are physically unhealthy, and without government assistance, they lack treatment for the most basic problems. Most important, they're mean about it. They will hesitate to open their lives up to others for a simple reason that they don't want to be judged. Well, honestly, if you're talking about them like this, there's not really a big fucking surprise as to why they might be mean or off-put by you.
Maybe they knew you were a smug asshole.
Yeah, and I'm also sure this just didn't happen, because he clearly doesn't talk to people. He just makes shit up.
Well, that's the thing is, like, I've been to plenty of places in Appalachia. Lived here my whole life. Are there mean people? Sure. There's mean people everywhere. Are there really nice people? Of course. Are there people who would give you the shirt off their back? Yep. But JD Vance wouldn't know that because he never took any time to get to know anyone. All he did was he looked around. He said, "This place sure seems like a real shithole to me." And that's what he did. He looked at it and said, he didn't want to be associated with that place because he thought it was beneath him. He's made sure that people know that he thought it was beneath him. And not just the place itself, but also the people there, too, should know that they're beneath him. That's what this is all about.
Yeah. Look, and the thing is like, when you're older, when you're an adult, you're supposed to be able to come back with some sort of perspective to these things. Because, when you're a kid, it's understandable to have some of those observations. I had them. I had a lot of chip on my shoulder and resentment when I was a kid in the area I grew up in. But then I went back and I had some actual perspective from life and realized there's a lot more complexity than just the bullshit that I thought or dealt with or even perceived was going on around me, which half the time wasn't even true. And so it's like, yet JD Vance either didn't realize that or did, but then decided to just write a book to profit off of it. Because it's it's easier to sell books when you tell a story like this. He
also says that they're like high drug use, right? Am I making that up?
Yeah, it's definitely heavily implied by him throughout, for sure. And I have a little bit about that here in a minute.
Okay, I'll wait till then. Let's talk then.
Well, so there's a whole, I think, one of the big things he really just goes off about is just how he passes judgment on people. That's why, I made that reel a little bit ago earlier this week where I said that he's like Regina George from Mean Girls. Because, this dude might as well have had a fucking burn book. So, we'll break down a little bit of categories here. Hillbillies in general, which he also identifies as one, while also shitting on them. These are all direct quotes, again, from the book. Avoidance and wishful thinking are forms of coping for hillbillies. Hillbillies learn to deal with uncomfortable truths by avoiding them or pretending better truths exist. It makes it harder to look at themselves honestly. Quote, the hardest truths about hill people are the ones that they must tell about themselves. We're conditioned to believe among hillbilly boys that academic success is a feminine trait. First of all, that was not my experience. Now, granted, I grew up in Parkersburg, which is less rural than Jackson, but I didn't think doing well in school was feminine or was gay or whatever the fuck you want to call it. But this is like, it's just, again, we go back to it. He is always talking about this like, us hillbillies are always us hillbillies. We're always told, don't you do good in school or that's gay.
I remember the first time I got a 4.0, I cried to my mom. I said, Mom, I have a 4.0, I'm gay. JD...
Mom, I think I'm gay. Look at my report card.
Look at my report card, I got an A. And they're all A's.
Which, like, just to be clear, when he says feminine trait, that's what he's heavily implying.
That's exactly what he's implying.
Gay to do good
That's
in school.
exactly what he's implying.
Just to be clear.
Yeah, like, he can call it what he wants. We know what he's saying. Like, it's a joke. Like, I'm saying it's a joke from my perspective. He is being legitimate. I was never taught that. Never, not in a million years did anyone ever say that to me. And I grew up with, like, an older brother, older sibling. No one ever was like, 4.0, gay. No one ever did that. They were like, wow.
Get some more B's, pussy.
Yeah, like, I think most of them were like, yeah, I can't wait for you to be my attorney. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that was...
Thank God somebody here is doing good.
Free legal counsel. Like,
yeah. I grew up with a salt of the earth, blue collar ass dad who worked with his hands his entire life, and he was like, you need to get good grades because you don't want to do what I do for a living.
Boom. That's what it really is. That right there is exactly the response you get from most people in Appalachia who have had to deal with either a very labor-intensive job or have had to deal with periods of unemployment or whatever. That is always their message to kids here is go to school. Make sure you get that done. Do well. Set yourself up because here in Appalachia, we know jobs come and go.
And you want to be able to not have to do this kind of job. He also I want to point this out. He painted Appalachia like it's some lawless war zone. And, like, I know that some places are pretty wild. Like, I get that. But, like, he's talking about people being forced to eat panties at knife point. And, which I don't even bother with the context. I don't know. But I'm like, okay, buddy, whatever. Sure, maybe that happened to you. Maybe it didn't.
You said at knife point?
Yes, eat panties at knife point.
All the panties I've eaten have been at gun point.
Yeah, I know.
Does he pay attention at all?
All the panties I eat have just been voluntarily. So.
Well, I didn't even want to talk about the voluntary ones. I was just meaning all, the ones that I didn't volunteer for.
Yeah, of course. So this one, I know that this one always rubs you the wrong way. Me too, but I know that you especially are pissed about this one. His view on people who utilize welfare, social services, any type of government assistance program, there is something that this guy just cannot get through his mind that somebody might need a little bit of help from the government. These are, again, all direct quotes, just so that you all know and understand how he feels about people that maybe has received food stamps or an unemployment check or something. Quote, I've known many welfare queens. Some were my neighbors. All were white. It was kind of weird to put race in there, whatever. Yeah. Quote, I think that's his way of saying, see, I'm not racist.
I think that was literally what I was about to say. It's his brush off moment where he could say, like, well, see, I'm actually just telling the truth.
Yeah, even though welfare queens is a racially charged term that was popularized by Ronald Reagan to talk about black women. Yep. Quote, its people are hardworking, except, of course, for its many food stamp recipients who show little interest in hard work. Hard work. Quote, one of our neighbors was a lifetime welfare recipient, but in between asking my grandmother to borrow her car or offering to trade food stamps for cash at a premium, she'd blather on about the importance of industriousness. So many people abuse the system. It's impossible for the hardworking people to get the help they need, she'd say. This was the construct she'd built in her head. Most of the beneficiaries of the system were extravagant moochers, but she, despite never having worked in her life, was an obvious exception. Wild story that I'm pretty sure probably didn't even happen, even if it did. It's like, okay, you're also inferring a lot of stuff here, buddy. But he's also using that example to say the same thing that she is. He also, this is where we're talking about making statistics up. People talk about hard work all the time in places like Middletown. But you can walk through a town where 30% of the young men
Yeah.
work fewer than 20 hours a week and find not a single person aware of their own laziness. I tell you what, to humor myself and him, I tried finding a statistic that even came close to that. Because he certainly didn't cite one in the book. He pulled it out of his ass. I tried to find anything, anywhere that would even come close to that. Like maybe he was teasing this out with something else. No, not a chance. Not a chance. Quote, many folks talk about working more than they actually work. Their rhetoric of hard work conflicts with the reality on the ground. This guy is obsessed with telling people that they're lazy, that he's the only one working hard here, and that because you're on food stamps, you're lazy, and that because there's people that receive government assistance, that means they're not working hard or they're working fewer hours than me, blah, 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 blah. We see this so many times, especially Republican politicians who say that like welfare fraud, they're just lazy, they don't want to work, they why would they have to get all this money from the government? And it's just so wrong, it's so obviously wrong. There's statistics that can prove that it's wrong, and yet they still do this shit all the time. What he does is he packages it in this cute little veneer wrapped around these stories about his mama, gun-toting mama, and this whole folksy, high-minded liberalness, and people, again, they buy it.
Yeah, I mean, the reason this pissed me off so much about JD, like, this is one of the main reasons that I just hate this fucking guy. And it's because of people like him that people like my mom suffered, went without, like, everything they could because she would be too embarrassed to ask for help. She was raising,
exactly.
My mom was raising 4 kids on her own, working, 40, 50, 60 hours a week, doing everything that she could to get by. At one point was driving from Doddridge County, West Virginia to Parkersburg, West Virginia to work every day to get by.
Which is like, what, like a 45, 50-minute drive at least?
In
an hour?
In a shitty old eco van that would break down half the time and she'd walk home. Like,
Jesus.
It's shit like that these fucking assholes like JD Vance push this bullshit agenda to make people feel bad. And you know what? Part of the thing that he says that woman said is true. It makes it hard for people who really need help to get help.
Yeah.
But it's not the position that the woman took. It's JD's bullshit position that's actually what makes things difficult, because his narrative does 2 things. 1, it puts people in power who say you don't actually need help. And 2, it puts people who need help in a state where they can't because they're too embarrassed, because they think they're going to be called a welfare queen. They think they're going to be told that their kids are worthless because they're worthless. They're going to be told that they're poor only because they chose to be poor. They put themselves in that position. There were plenty of people in the world who would say that my mom, oh, you're the one who got, you got divorced. That's JD Vance's fucking mindset. He wouldn't look at the fact that, like, she came from a relationship where she was getting her, the shit beat out of her. He would look at it as, well, you're the person who put yourself there. Like that. Yeah. That's the type of asshole that's running as the vice presidential candidate on the Republican ticket, which is why I'll do everything I ever can to make sure that he doesn't ever get to the White House. I mean, he is that bad. And this is the topic that always pisses me off the most, because he is dangerous with this terrible rhetoric.
Absolutely. You brought up that example of, like, always finding something. Like, there's, no matter who, first of all, there's always going to be those one-off examples of people that abuse the system.
Sure.
That's always going to happen. It's like the old adage, like, government leaky bucket, that kind of thing. There's always going to be those examples, but then the people that already have a resentment for the system are always going to cite those examples.
I have an example.
And it will, and just one other quick point, it's a extreme example of, like, the whole, oh, just don't buy so many Starbucks coffees all the time, and then you'll be able to afford XYZ. It's a complete misunderstanding of an economic situation, and they're just using it, like, they're just finding reasons to undermine what somebody's real problems are.
Yeah, it would be like somebody creating a fake organization to help people who suffered from the opioid epidemic. It'd be like, like saying,
and then use it to launch their Senate campaign.
It'd be like saying don't support any of those organizations.
Interesting. just a random example that
Just
came out of
nowhere.
Pulled out of your ass.
Same thing.
Yeah. Okay. Very good point. Very good point. It's interesting because I think like part of this came from his grandmother. So this book, like I mentioned, paints things very much in a black and white viewpoint. He'll try to say that he's talking in shades of gray. It's almost always black and white. It generally ignores those nuances and operates under this erroneous mentality of if you work hard, you'll be rewarded, and those who are struggling simply haven't worked hard enough. His grandma told him, and this is in the book, quote, "Never be like those fucking losers who think the deck is stacked against them." And I think he took that too hard, and that is genuinely how he believes. I think he believes that nobody's deck is stacked against them. And one thing that was ironic about that is on the same page, he mentions that before LBJ established the Appalachian Regional Commission, there was basically only one road in and out of Jackson, Kentucky, and it was a hard road to travel. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, seems like not having roads is one way that the motherfucking deck is stacked against you. I don't know. Perhaps.
Wow. That's the thing, though, man. Like, that's just this guy. Like, it's disgusting how he's able to do this. That's why we have to talk about it. People often, like, I've gotten friends, like, no joke, I've had friends who are like, man, you guys talk about it too much, blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, you know what? I'd rather we never have to talk about it. But now we have to. We're forced to, because if not, then he gets to spread a narrative. We just happen to have a decently big platform, big enough to where people will at least listen to our voice now and say, hey, these two guys actually say what JD says is bullshit. Oh, wait, they also told us about this book that talks about how JD's, opinion is bullshit. And then they told us about this guy. And then they told us about this person. Like, that's the type of shit that we have to deal with now. Because if not, he gets to control the narrative and he gets to win the game when it comes to what Appalachia is. And we're not going to let that fucking happen.
Exactly. And you know what? The Biden campaign's rapid response team shared some of our tweets the other day. So you know what? We're making it onto their radar. So hopefully it'll make it into public conscience and people will start to see, oh, this guy actually hates you.
Yeah. Hopefully. That's the thing. He doesn't like you. He doesn't.
No, he wants to use you, and he's used you like his entire career.
Entire life. That's all it's been.
That's it. A little bit on the drug addiction thing, and then we'll get into like the money and privilege aspect of this. So you mentioned drug addiction. He, throughout the book, just has this very bizarrely hostile attitude towards drug addiction, where he like tries to hedge his bets a little bit because his mom was a drug addict. His mom suffered from addiction. Despite growing up in a family plagued by it, though, he shows very little empathy for people impacted by it and often relies on stereotypical tropes and assumptions to paint Appalachia as a morally bankrupt and destitute place. He used this example where his mom came back from rehab, and she's like, "I have an addiction, or it's a disease, so, and just like you can't blame somebody for a cancerous tumor, you shouldn't blame me for this disease." I understand his perspective. It kind of sounds like bullshit coming from her, but it's also like you can't discount that aspect of things, and he really was. And you see this a lot where he talks about drug addiction and referring, like, we're talking about addicts in such dehumanizing ways in this book. I mean, he refers to his community as like a drug-addled person. This is the reality of our community. It's about a naked druggie destroying what little value exists in her life, putting the onus on the addict. They are destroying it. They are doing this. And yeah, there are some people that do not help themselves, and a lot of the blame can be put at their feet, but a lot of it can't, especially like when it comes to the addiction crises in that community, which is an opioid crisis, which is often started because of overprescribing pills by their doctor or by big pharmaceutical companies, and they're given those legitimately for legitimate injuries and then become addicted because they're highly fucking addictive.
Yeah. But he doesn't want to talk about that. He doesn't want to talk about that.
No, that would undermine his whole thing.
Then, yeah, he doesn't want to talk about that because then it would be odd, Chuck, because then you have all of these well-educated people, like doctors and pharmacists, who are just manipulating these poor people But that doesn't fit the narrative because we want people to know that because he's well educated and they're well educated, they know what's actually best for us, and they're the only ones that can lead us to the saving grace. And so he had openly admits that these people are manipulative, but they're also smart. He's very nervous about that. So he has to maintain the effect that people are just dumb and they're just poor and stupid. So that's why they do the things they do.
Yeah,
And lazy. Don't forget lazy.
Like, well, and ironically, it's lazy of him to be writing and describing people like that, but it's also not surprising. I wanted to pivot. This is sort of the last bucket of this I want to get into, and then we can talk about a little bit about like post Hillbilly Elegy shit because I think it's worth touching on some things. But a lot of like what he leans on in the personal narrative is I grew up in poverty. I grew up in a broken household. Definitely, like there's some truth to that, right? Like he definitely grew up in a broken household.
Why I live with his grandparents.
Yeah, and there were parts of his life where he was poor for sure, but there were definitely big parts of it where he was not. And I think that that's something where we're nitpicking here a little bit, but you have to be able to look at this and realize like he sneaks some of the stuff into the book. And when you look back on it, you're like, oh, you actually had a lot more legs up than you admit to, and that people realize. These are, again, all direct quotes. Quote, Mom had recently acquired her nursing license, and Bob, who I think was his stepdad maybe at the time, made a great salary, so we had plenty of money. Though it made little sense for a rural Ohio family with a combined income of over $100,000 to struggle with money, they did because they bought things they didn't need. So his parents were frivolous. They spent where they shouldn't have, but they made good money. And I can tell you there's a lot of difference between making good money and spending it poorly versus not having it. There are problems with both, but there's a big difference. And later on, he also, though, like shifts his tone. He says, oh, when we were poor, a status my mama wore like a badge of honor, but one I'd hardly come to grips with. These are things where it's like he'll say on the campaign trail that he grew up poor, but then in the book he'll go back and forth, and he won't admit it sometimes, but then you read stuff like this and realize this guy had a lot more legs up than what he lets on. Quote, identity is an odd thing for me. During my first trip to California, I began to understand. Uncle Jimmy flew Lindsay and me, I don't remember who Lindsay is, it doesn't matter, to his home in Napa, California. Knowing that I'd be visiting him, I told every person I could that I was headed to California in the summer, and what was more, flying for the first time. The main reaction was disbelief that my uncle had enough money to fly two people, neither of whom were his children, out to California. It is a testament to class consciousness of my youth that my friend's first thoughts drifted to the cost of the airplane ticket. So, yeah, and when I was thinking about this, that would have been mine too, because first of all, flying was very expensive, especially when you were younger. It still is, but I think it was even more so back then. He brushes this off like it's nothing, but that is huge. If you grew up in that area, you're flying out to Napa. Your uncle's paying for you to fly out to Napa. He also had therapy sessions as a kid, both with and without his mom. Like, that's not the reality for a lot of people in Appalachia, especially poor people in Appalachia. They can't afford to go to therapy, and they may not even have access to it.
Good point. Yeah, I needed therapy as a kid. Couldn't afford it. I been open about that. Yeah, man. I think you hit the nail on the head there, though, and I think this is what everybody's perspective, in my opinion, or at least should be open to this, is that JD Vance had some bad shit in his life. No doubt about it.
100%.
But he doesn't acknowledge the second half of that, and that is, yes, he had all these bad things happen, but then he gets plucked essentially from that situation. His grandparents start to take care of him. Not the grandparents that you've referenced as Mamaw, but the other two grandparents in Ohio. They take care of him and essentially bring him in as, their own child, and, push him through, help raise him, give him the values that he's, supposedly established in his adult life, but which he's given up now. But they did a lot for him. And really, there's only like 3 pages where he even acknowledges that his grandparents were, great to him. He talks about, his grandpa was a hard worker and stuff, but he never really gives them the credit that they're due. He just shits on people, and it's like he knew. Like I said, JD's not dumb. Like he knew that people would read him shitting on people. They wouldn't read just a story about how great his grandparents were.
Yeah, and he also knew that most people are not gonna analyze the shit out of this book like we're doing. Most people are gonna read it like kind of casually, and read and believe it, and they're gonna see this as a really great story. And in some respects, it is. But it's like he had a lot of legs up, and he's also and it's fucked up that like he has not learned anything from that. And he's saying, "Oh, it's because I work hard." It's not just because you work hard, buddy. It's not. You had some legs up where a lot of other people around you didn't. And honestly, like your life, there was a couple fuck ups away from you being in a very different position. There's also a couple of fuck ups away from him being in an even better position. Last thing I want to mention, because this is probably the most infuriating and also genuinely the most confusing, his view on payday lending, which for those of you who don't know, predatory lenders are those check cash and loan places where they loan you out money at absurd interest rates, and it really preys on poor people and gets them caught into these endless debt loops. He goes on this screed where he used to talk. I guess he worked or clerked for this Ohio state senator that was opposing a bill that would have curbed the limits on interest rates on payday loans in Ohio, which ultimately later on that bill passed. But he goes on to like praise these institutions, like, "Oh, I took one out once, and it was really important for me, and it really helped me out in a tough time." And he says they're important so poor people like him could get access to money when they don't qualify for credit. He fails to mention that he paid it off on or before the timeline where their interest rates go up to insane amounts. And so many people, even people I know that are conservatives, like diehard Ted Cruz Trump supporters, hate these institutions because of how predatory they are.
Yeah, they're like, what person would think, like, okay, so let me say this. The idea behind making money available like that on short-term loans makes total sense, right? It's unfair to say like, hey, it doesn't make any sense. It does. It makes perfect sense, and people do have to use them. There's no doubt about that.
Especially if you can't access credit, can't go to a bank.
1,000%. Yeah. However, the percentages on these loans are the biggest issue. The payback,
outrageous.
The payback rates they're immoral. Like that's where they are. They are at a point where you look at them, a reasonable person would look at it and go, "This is theft."
Some of the compounding rates are literally 400, 500%.
Right. It is not logical to be okay with that. But we're at a point where no one should be protecting those companies. No one should be saying that they're worthwhile companies. Like, they're not. They're bad companies. Like, it's point blank. They're predatory.
Absolutely.
The concept is okay, like I said. It's the actual utilization that's the issue.
Yeah, I mean, and there are institutions now, not as many at all, because there's a lot of money to be made off these. And one of the biggest kingpins of the payday loan industry lives in Cleveland, Tennessee, by the way.
Really?
In Appalachia. Yeah, he's a piece of trash. Talked about him, a way long time ago. Anyway, not worth bringing up right now, but they're very predatory. There are some institutions that do this, but at like very low or capped interest rates. In some states, I think Ohio being one, has capped interest rates at a certain level, which is good, which is what this bill was trying to do, and he was opposing it. What an asshole. Because, you just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and be fine. But, I think like the reason why we're going through this book, and this is just a big broad strokes of it, is to kind of tell you the character of this person, what he really believes, and why we weren't surprised he ran for Senate, first of all, and that he kind of flipped to full MAGA, because this is like what he believes. He resents people. So we're going to move on really quickly to some of the post-Hillbilly Elegy stuff. So as you all know, Ron Howard and Amy Adams and Glenn Close torched their careers by making and being in the movie. I think Ron Howard thought he was going to really slam dunk that shit out of the park, and then people realized, hey, this is actually not a great story when it comes down to it, because the guy is reprehensible, and the movie came out right as he was running for Senate, which is kind of hilarious timing. But So he went on the whole lecture circuit, CNN contributor, did a TED talk, did all this stuff, like really was sort of the golden child among the never Trump people. And that's who he described himself as. After this glow up that he had, he was sort of the hillbilly never Trumper, and he was so comfortable in those green rooms, John, back there, like rubbing elbows in New York City and Los Angeles and San Francisco and DC. He loved it, man. He ate that shit up. And so just want to list a couple of things he's called Donald Trump over his career, John. He called America's Hitler. Mm-hmm. Compared him to an opioid, which is, as Pete Buttigieg said very eloquently, like, given where he's from, that's one of the most vile things that you can call a person, and I agree with that. Described him as a moral disaster, an idiot, noxious, a total fraud, reprehensible, and cultural heroin.
Yeah,
that's pretty
big fan, dude.
Cultural heroin. Huge fan. Now he is his running mate. Wild. But John, the thing that I think is most nefarious, which you referenced earlier, is the opioid charity that he had. Charity being a very charitable way of describing it.
Do you remember what it was called? I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head.
Our Ohio Renewal. He claimed to be moving back to Ohio to help solve the opioid crisis.
And didn't he write an article, Why I'm Moving Home?
Yeah, I believe so. It was in like the New York Times.
Yeah, it was in the Times. Yeah, he wrote an article called Why I'm Moving Back Home, or Why I'm Moving Home. And
whitewash this hillbilly, baby. Let's go.
Yeah, I mean, he really, really pushed forward. And Chuck, turns out that didn't end up being that successful, right?
To nobody's shock, no. It's actually wild, like how little they did to cover up what a fraud it was. He started, it was essentially a 501c3, I think, maybe even C4. It ended up paying for polling, campaign advisors, and travel to launch his Senate campaign, while turns out illegally taking a tax write-off for it. Business Insider found that in its first year, the group spent more money paying for, quote, management services provided by Vance's top political advisor at the time than on programs to fight opioid abuse.
Wow.
Vance's campaign didn't include any of the experience at Our Ohio Renewal on his campaign website, understandably so, and he never really answered any questions about it. His law firm that he used to work for, by the way, also lobbied for Purdue Pharma. I forgot about that. So this guy has actually been making the opioid crisis arguably worse.
Yeah. Turns out him and Donald Trump aren't that different.
Hey, you know what? When I said that he understands Trump, I didn't realize
he was
when
Trump.
I said that how much. Yeah. God, he really is.
Yeah,
like Trump would do. I think Trump did do that.
Trump exploited people at all cost in business.
Yeah, he tanked. App Harvest is Trump University of ag tech startups.
Yeah.
Really.
I mean, it's all of the gimmicks that Donald Trump did on the side to make a quick buck. It's the ultimate con man move. I always say that I got the con man gene from my dad. It's just I chose to use it in like a beneficial way for society.
Uh-huh.
And
okay.
And you have a way to do it. Like, my dad, ultimate con man, very good at it, right? Donald Trump, very good at it. JD Vance, very good at it. But you could use that power for good or evil. Those guys are not, well, they're using it for the good of themselves, I guess you could argue. Not for the good of this country, not for the good of most people, and definitely not for the good of people who have suffered from the opioid epidemic.
Definitely not. And it's really shameful. And honestly, it's really evil to do that.
Yeah.
Because this is a guy, like, it's not just he grew up there, John. Like, and you know this because your dad was suffered from substance use disorder,
he
right?
had some issues.
Yeah. Sorry to bring it up, but JD Vance's mom.
That's what bothers me so much.
Big part of it.
Yeah, like that's what bothers me about it. Like I am very open about the things, how terrible of a person that my biological father was. I hate him to this day, right? Like, I would never do this. Like, I would never create a fake charity like, and still do, like, I would still have the feelings of like, yeah, like this affected my family. Like, how could I do this?
And it's like, this is one of, like, opioids are one of the drugs where it's like, you can most easily establish the case that most people, it is not their fault they got addicted.
No, I mean, that's
like,
the thing.
You know, and obviously, like, I think it's wrong to blame people in general for that stuff. But like, you look like, you know, like crack, cocaine, you know, that kind of stuff. People like those recreational drugs. Okay, like people get addicted to those a lot of times because they choose to use them.
Yeah.
Not always, you know. But with this, it's like, and I'm not trying to like make a quibble about this, but like a lot of people get addicted to opioids because they're prescribed them legitimately for back pain, or like they're in the fucking coal mines or something and they have pain from working their whole lives. You know, the hard work that JD Vance says doesn't exist. I feel like it doesn't get talked about enough with him, but it truly is evil.
Yeah, I mean, I often talk about like I've talked about it with my sister and with Taylor before. I have a very addictive personality. Like, I've recognized that. Like, I'm one of those people who that's how I process, is like I can become addicted to things pretty easily. It's like whenever, you know, and it's weird stuff too. Like, or I shouldn't say weird stuff. It's stuff that you maybe don't always think about. Like, back in the day, at one point, I got addicted to working out. Like, legitimately, like, people always joke about that. I was working out 6 hours a day. Like,
I remember
that
was when you were. That was pretty wild, actually. I was like, how? And
it was it wasn't like I was going and sitting there I was working out for 6 hours a day. Like, this was no joke. Like, I was addicted to it, you know. And I just have an addictive personality. That's why I always be careful, like, on when I do anything. Like, I always have been, like, I don't want to become an alcoholic, so I don't drink that much. Like, I say that I drank a ton yesterday because it was my buddy's wedding, but like, you know, I don't like to drink because I'm worried about that. I can't imagine getting handed pain pills. I think my personality would drive me to become addicted to it. I really do. I have stayed away from all of that, luckily. But that would definitely worry me. I would have to be open and honest, like, with my wife, and be like, hey, just watch me. You know what I mean? Like, if I had to really take them. But that's also why, like, I'll go back to, I mean, that's why I think medical marijuana is such a great thing. But I digress there because that's not what we're talking about. But yeah, that's the type of stuff that JD Vance doesn't want to talk about.
Yeah, you're very correct, 100%. Well, I mean, this is just scratching the surface on him, barely. You're gonna hear a lot of things from him about him from himself, also from other people. I'm hoping I can put some of the stuff, especially from Hillbilly Elegy, into some sort of format that people can use to talk to other people about him. That's my hope. But if you're listening to this, like, you can do that too. And remember, like, there is so much about this guy that's horrible, reprehensible, and just shady as fuck that people, even if they're like, you know, Trump curious or undecided or just, you know, somebody that doesn't vote, like, it will concern them, it will disgust them, and I hope that, you know, people take that seriously.
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal. Even if you just want to take snippets of this episode and be like, hey, I don't know if you heard, but the guy faked a charity. I mean, here's two guys talking about it. Like, that kind of stuff. That's fine with me. Just, you know, and there's the thing to remember is, in all politics, you can show anyone anything, and it's not going to change everybody's mind. You got to move on. You got to move on, and you got to talk to the people that you think you actually can talk to. Because that's what's going to take in this election.
Very true, very true. But there are people that can be persuaded, and I hope that we find them. That's all I got on this guy right now. I don't think I can stand to talk about him anymore.
No, and I think that this is a good discussion. I mean, look, if you like our JD Vance coverage, like if that's why maybe you found us in the first place or whatever, buckle up. Because I'm sure that this is not the last episode where we talk about old JD, especially because he's now in the limelight.
JD.
On the other hand, if you hate it when we talk about JD Vance, maybe take a break until November.
but don't. We'll sprinkle in other things.
Join our Patreon, because that's mostly where we don't really like to talk about JD. We like to have fun there. Not this isn't fun.
Yeah.
I love talking about old JD and how he's a detriment to everyone but himself. But just being honest, we're going to talk about him. We're going to talk about everything. And JD, the last thing I'll say is I don't even dislike JD because of his politics as much. Like, at least in politics, normally, let me say this. Normally, I can be like, I at least can understand where the person's coming from. I might disagree with you, but at least I can see where you got that thought process. Now, not when it comes to being, like, bigoted or anything like that. That I just can't. Just, like, cross the aisle stuff. He's just someone that's just such a bad guy. That, like he's just a bad guy. Like, that's all it is. Like, he's a villain. Like, that's it.
He is. He's a villain that's really good at masking it as not being a
Yeah,
villain.
he's a in wrestling, he's what they call an anti-hero. It's a guy who you don't really know if you're supposed to root for him, but you want to. Like Stone Cold, that was a really good example. Now JD Vance, no Stone Cold, right?
No Stone Cold, no.
But when Austin got big, he was an anti. That's what he was. He was a guy who you're like, am I supposed to like you? Because I kind of like you. That's JD Vance. He's like, am I supposed to like you? And what we're telling you is no, because he doesn't like you. Because he doesn't like you.
No. And it's okay not to like him. You have our permission.
He sucks.